The Roman legionary is often remembered as the iron embodiment of civilization. Shining armor, perfect discipline, a soldier who carried the light of Rome to the farthest edges of the known world. But this image, polished by centuries of legend, hides a far darker truth. Rome did not conquer through noble duels or gentlemanly warfare. The empire was built on calculated cruelty, on weapons designed not only to kill but to terrify, mutilate, and break the enemy's will before the final blow was ever struck. To understand how Rome crushed entire nations and held an empire together for centuries, we must set aside the romantic myth and look at the brutal reality, the weapons that turned ordinary men into instruments of terror. The story begins with the weapon that became the very symbol of Rome, the gladius. At first glance, it was nothing extraordinary. A short sword, barely half a meter in length, plain and simple compared to the long barbarian blades that looked far more impressive. But the gladius was an ingenious piece of engineering. Its purpose was not to impress, but to kill with ruthless efficiency. In the crush of battle, Roman soldiers stood shield to shield, their movements restricted, their vision narrowed. A long sword was useless here. What mattered was the ability to stab quickly, accurately, and fatally. The gladius was perfect for that. From behind the safety of his massive shield, the legionary would thrust forward, the short blade slipping between ribs, puncturing lungs, tearing through intestines, slicing arteries that no doctor of the age could hope to repair. A single stab to the abdomen condemned an enemy to hours of agony, bleeding internally, screaming in front of his comrades. This was not an accident, it was the design. Deep thrusts caused horrific wounds that killed slowly, breaking the morale of those still fighting. Ancient historian Titus Livius described the shock of Macedonian soldiers when they first faced the gladius. They had never seen wounds so grotesque, torn organs spilling out, limbs severed, men writhing in unthinkable pain. The gladius was not just a sword. It was a psychological weapon, a reminder that facing Rome meant not just death, but a death so cruel that even hardened warriors recoiled in horror. Yet before the legionary even drew his sword, the enemy was already being dismantled by another terrifying Roman innovation, the pilum. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary spear, but it was one of the most diabolical inventions of the ancient world. The pilum was about 2 meters long, with a wooden shaft and a thin iron shank that ended in a hardened steel tip. This clever design had one purpose: to render an enemy's shield useless. Thrown from a distance of 20 to 30 meters, the pilum's sharp head punched through enemy shields. Then, under the weight of the shaft, the soft iron shank bent. This simple trick made the spear impossible to remove. A warrior suddenly found himself holding a shield with a 2-meter pole dragging it down, unbalancing him, exhausting him. He had a choice: drop his shield and fight unprotected, or keep it and stumble around helplessly. Either choice spelled disaster when the Romans advanced. And if the pilum struck flesh rather than wood, the consequences were even worse. The bent shank tore jagged wounds, almost impossible to treat, often fatal. Imagine the sight: comrades nailed to their shields, writhing with bent iron lodged in their bodies. The Romans understood that such scenes broke more than shields, they shattered morale. But even the gladius and pilum were only part of a broader strategy of brutality. The Roman shield, the scutum, might look like nothing more than a defensive tool. A curved wall of wood and leather, taller than the man behind it. But in Roman hands, it became an offensive weapon as well. In the famous tortoise formation, these shields created an impenetrable wall, arrows clattering harmlessly off their surfaces. To enemies, it was like watching a living fortress advance. And when the formation finally slammed into the front line, the scutum revealed its darker side. The bottom edge could be driven into an enemy's shins, breaking bones and dropping him instantly. The top edge smashed into faces and throats, crushing jaws and windpipes. At the center was the umbo, a metal boss that turned every shield into a giant knuckle duster. A punch from a Roman shield could break ribs, knock out teeth, or leave a man gasping on the ground just long enough for the gladius to finish him. A wall of soldiers advancing with these weapons was less like an army and more like a row of human battering rams. The barbarian warrior swinging his mighty sword suddenly found himself pressed, beaten, stabbed, and utterly overwhelmed. The Romans also relied on weapons that didn't require a man to hold them at all. One of the cruelest was the caltrip, a small spiked trap scattered across battlefields. Simple, cheap, and devastating. Each caltrop had 4 spikes so that whichever way it landed, one point always stuck upward, ready to pierce flesh. Horses galloping into battle suddenly collapsed with shattered hooves, throwing riders to their deaths. Infantry charging across grassy fields screamed as spikes tore through sandals or lodged in their feet. Even if the wound didn't kill, it crippled, and in ancient warfare, being unable to walk was often a death sentence. Infections set in quickly, leading to gangrene, fever, and slow decay. Caltrops didn't just injure, they turned the ground itself into a weapon of terror, an invisible minefield designed to maim and demoralize. As the centuries passed, Rome continued to refine its arsenal, adding ever more insidious tools. One of these was the plumata, a small lead-weighted dart hidden behind the shield, thrown just as the enemy closed in. Light, fast, and vicious, the plumata could pierce leather armor or even chain mail, embedding deep in flesh. Each legionary carried several of these, raining them down in the final moments before swords clashed. Imagine rushing forward to finally reach the Roman line, only to be met with a sudden storm of darts piercing your body, dropping men in the last desperate seconds of a charge. Beyond handheld weapons, Rome's brutality extended to massive machines of war. The ballista was essentially a giant crossbow powered by twisted sinew and rope. It could fire bolts the size of spears with such force that they passed through multiple men at once. Entire lines collapsed under their relentless fire. For defenders in a city under siege, the ballista was a nightmare. Bolts whistling through the air, striking without warning, tearing bodies apart in an instant. But if the ballista was Rome's sniper rifle, then the onager was its howitzer. The onager hurled boulders weighing up to 80 kilograms high into the air, smashing walls, collapsing roofs, crushing anyone unlucky enough to be beneath. Worse still, the Romans sometimes loaded them with rotting corpses or diseased animals, turning cities into plague pits. This was total war, not just breaking defenses, but destroying morale, spreading terror, and ensuring the enemy's surrender long before the final assault. As the empire evolved, so did its weapons. The gladius gave way to the longer spada, better suited for the looser formations of the late empire. It could slash as well as stab, fitting the changing nature of Roman warfare. But in truth, these shifts were minor compared to the 2 most brutal weapons Rome ever wielded, neither of which could be held in the hand. The first was iron discipline. Roman soldiers obeyed orders without hesitation, no matter how dangerous. Cowardice was punished by death, sometimes by the hands of one's own comrades. This discipline allowed the legions to perform complex maneuvers in the chaos of battle, to hold the line under unbearable pressure, to become more than individuals. They became parts of a machine. The second was Roman engineering. Roads, fortifications, siege engines, and supply chains meant that Rome could fight wars not just with swords and spears, but with infrastructure. They could starve cities into submission, flood battlefields, or build fortresses overnight. Against this combination of discipline and engineering, even the fiercest warriors of the ancient world had little chance. And so, when we talk about Rome's most brutal weapons, we are not just listing swords, spears, or siege engines. We are uncovering a system of warfare designed to kill, maim, terrify, and ultimately erase resistance. Every weapon, from the gladius that spilled intestines to the onager that rained death from the sky, was a link in the same chain. The Roman army was not just a collection of men, it was a relentless machine of conquest. And its darkest truth is this: Rome did not conquer the world with glory. It conquered it with terror, with cruelty, and with weapons that still haunt the imagination 2,000 years later.